welcome to the Art of Being Human. I'm going into the signs of complicated grief. Now, what is complicated grief? Complicated grief is when you do not move through the stages of grief normally, and as a result of that, you get stuck in it. And when you get stuck in it, those symptoms of grief can last for a long time. And depression certainly is one of them, but there are physical symptoms as well. There are symptoms in terms of lack of creativity, and I'm going to run through these symptoms so that you'll kind of get a handle on them. And you do have some of these symptoms during the normal grief process, but as you get better and better from the grief, these symptoms will subside. If you feel like you're having unusual symptoms and you're grieving because of a recent loss, a lot of times those symptoms are going to be related to that loss. And it's nothing necessarily that you have to worry about. It's just a part of the process of grieving. I've heard it said that whatever symptoms you have after a loss, just attribute it to the loss, because that's probably what it is, and it's a form of grieving. But if it lasts too long, or if you're in danger of either hurting yourself or hurting another person, then you must get help. There's a point at which you can't do it alone anymore. So I'm going to list these off. Now, these symptoms will last maybe several weeks, sometimes several months, but remember, we're talking about a complicated grief here. We're not talking about a normal grief. In a normal grief, symptoms subside within, a few weeks, or actually maybe even sooner. You start feeling better maybe a couple of weeks after a death. It's still a long, protracted kind of symptom, but there is hope for your recovery, and you can feel yourself getting better and better. Well, here are some of the symptoms. Actually, I have quite a few of them. Withdrawal from relationships. Generally, you just don't want to be with people. Withdrawal from normal activities that are associated with the deceased, which is really common, and I've mentioned before that you may need to start a new set of practices, a new set of things that you're doing, a new set of rituals. There's sometimes where people seem not to be mourning. They show no signs of mourning, but deep down they are. So an absence of mourning may be a symptom of a complicated grief. Believe it or not, it works. Unlimited mourning, where you mourn all the time and you never seem to get out of it. Severe depression. Severe psychosomatic problems. What's a psychosomatic problem? I don't think they use the word psychosomatic as much as they used to. It's called psychophysiologic, but it means the same thing. When you have physical symptoms, what would your physical symptoms be? Well, you might always feel sick with flu symptoms. You might always have an ulcer. I mean, you might have stomach problems that you feel like an ulcer. Various physical things. You know, a lot of people, when they get an ulcer, they consider it to be psychosomatic, because if you're upset about something, sometimes your stomach pays the price for it. But now they're finding out that a true ulcer is caused by viruses, and you be treated for the virus and the ulcer goes away, just to give you that update. There are personality changes. You may not be the kind, sweet person like you usually are. You're confrontational, you're argumentative, it's hard to get along with you. Too much guilt. Now, that can lower your self-esteem. A lot of people feel guilty when someone has died. Why would they feel guilty? Well, maybe because they had a bad relationship or not a good relationship with the person while they were living, and they never resolved that. And, you know, the Bible says, do not let the sun go down on your anger. And what it means, if you have a problem with somebody, iron it out beforehand and before they die. And then you don't have anything to feel guilty about. Sometimes the guilt is a false guilt. If I had only been a better person, if I had only paid more attention, and all of these things, most of those kinds of things are false guilt. You will dredge up things in your mind to feel guilty about, because it's a grief process, and that's one of the signs of the grief process. And normally you might not have that much guilt, but you do have that guilt, and it's part of the grief reaction. If you have guilt, If it's something that you should, that you have done, then just, you have to forgive yourself, whatever it is, because the person is no longer around to forgive you, so you have to forgive yourself. And that may require some help for you to do that. If you've had some kind of a strained relationship with somebody and now they pass on, you feel guilty. You feel guilty because the relationship was never restored. Nothing was ever healed in the relationship. And if that's the case, then you have to learn to forgive yourself for it. And there are some times when people feel guilty anyway, even though the guilt isn't necessary, even though they haven't done anything wrong. Children particularly are prone to this. They have all kinds of reasons why they feel guilty about a relationship gone wrong, or their parents getting a divorce. A child will always take the guilt, and I'm always telling them, it's not your fault your parents were abusive. It's not your fault that your parents separated. You know, they take guilt where it's not necessary to take guilt at all. But adults sometimes do the same thing and take guilt when it's not necessary at all. And that may need to be worked with from a therapeutic point of view. You may need to get some help with that. Sometimes too much anger. When you have too much anger, you can be angry at the person who died. There's no reason why that doesn't happen. In a normal grief reaction, a person may be angry at the person who died, and then they feel guilty because they feel angry, because they realize that it's not logical. The person may have clung to life as long as they could, and they couldn't cling to life any longer. Their bodies just shut down and they were gone. And somehow you feel angry at them for that. That can be part of a normal grief reaction. You can feel angry at the person who died. You can even take some time and yell at them. Why did you leave me alone? Why did you do this? Why did you leave? You know, and knowing full well that it's not logical, but that's the way you feel. When you're in a grief reaction, you have to understand that the way you feel is not logical. And it's okay not to be logical, because it's a period of time in your life where your brain can't quite get it, and you can't be logical all the time. You know, people are emotional. They're more emotional than physical, or more emotional and intellectual a lot of periods of time. And so therefore you have to accept that as a reality of your grief, and that should subside with the rest of the grief. But if it doesn't, then you have to have some help with it. Phobias, somehow you can get phobias, and some phobias in terms of what the deceased person had a certain illness, now you're afraid of the illness, maybe you're going to get it, and this kind of thing. So phobias. Drug and alcohol use can increase during grief because it's a way of numbing yourself. What do people want to do when they feel grief or anxiety? They want to numb it. They want to get it under control. And the thing is, sometimes the worst thing you can do is to try to get it into control. Accept it as a reality, but a temporary reality, and then let it phase. I've always said, and it's something that my mother used to tell me when I was young, if you acknowledge that you have certain emotions, it will ease the emotions, because the body is fighting to be recognized. The mind is fighting to have you recognize what's going on within it. And when you recognize it and acknowledge it, you don't have to tell everybody everywhere, but when you acknowledge it, even to yourself, or maybe also to a close personal friend who listens to you, then you see it's going to lose its hold. It's been recognized. The mind doesn't have to fight to be recognized. It has been recognized, and that's going to lessen the intensity of the emotion that you're feeling. It usually works, it usually happens, and it's a great relief when it does happen. Because if you try to push it down and push it down and push it down, I will not feel this way, I will not feel this way, I'm not going to do this, then it just fights to be recognized. And when it fights to be recognized, it makes the symptoms worse. So all you have to do is say, okay, I get it, you know. This is the way I'm feeling, and this is the way I'm going to feel for a while. It'll be okay, because it's not going to be forever. It will ease up. But I recognize the reality of what I'm suffering at this moment. And I may even tell somebody about it. And then you see, it doesn't have to hang on for dear life to be recognized, because it already has been recognized. It's like a little child sitting at the breakfast table and everybody's talking, and the little child wants more milk. More milk, more milk, and he's screaming, more milk, or whatever he's screaming, and everyone says, you're talking too loud, shut up. Well, if they gave him the milk and recognized, okay, here's more milk, the child wouldn't continue to scream because he already has what he wants. And it's a little bit like that. Recognize where you are, and then it doesn't have to fight to be recognized because it's been recognized. I know I'm talking a lot about this, but I really think it's important, and I think a lot of people don't get it, so it bears repeating. Now, drug and alcohol use, I mentioned before, there's a feeling of deadness. A lot of people who go through grief feel dead inside. You know, there's no life there. Everything is just kind of going according to plan, and you are just behaving because that's the way you're expected to do, but there's no vibrancy in your life, and there's a feeling of deadness. And sometimes a person who's going through a complicated grief will have some of the symptoms that the loved one had before they died. Supposing your loved one died of, say, a brain tumor, supposing they had a lot of pain in their head, suddenly you develop headaches, and it makes you wonder, could I catch it? Well, very little is catchable. You know, you're not going to catch cancer. You're not going to catch things that do not have a virus attached to it where you can catch it. But you may have some of the symptoms, and your behavior may change. Behavior towards your family and towards your friends are going to change. You're going to be abrupt. You're going to be sarcastic, maybe rude. Maybe you were not like that before. That can also be a part of a grief reaction, a complicated grief reaction. You may be hostile toward people that you blame for the death. Supposing that a person died because they were in an accident. All of a sudden you're hostile and you're angry and you really want to get to the person who caused your loved one to die. It's their fault. They have to pay the price. You know, I've seen a lot of things on television and training films and this kind of thing about how people react when they face the person who has been charged with a crime that ended in their loved one's death. And some of them are so, the statements, the impact statements that people say are so vitriolic. You know, I hate you, I hope you burn in hell, you know, I hope terrible things happen to you. You shouldn't be allowed to live. All of this kind of thing. And it does nothing for the healing process. What does help with the healing process is an acknowledgement of that, and an acknowledgement without acting out on that, and also a sense of forgiveness. If you have a sense of forgiveness, it may not help in terms of the situation, but it'll help calm you down. It will help give you closure. If you can forgive a person for doing something to you, and I'm not necessarily saying this is a death situation, but in any situation, if you can forgive somebody that's done something to you, you get that closure right away because you've forgiven them. It's a chapter now closed. You move on with your life, and you can do it even if the person who hurt you is no longer there or no longer alive or has moved across country so that you'll never see them again. You still can get a closure by a forgiving spirit, and then you move on with your life. It's a chapter now ended. I want to bring this up because forgiveness is a healing tool. We think of it in terms of a religious thing because the Bible talks about forgiveness, but it's also a healing tool. And when you forgive, you get better. And it doesn't have any influence necessarily on the other person who doesn't know they've been forgiven or may not even be around so that you can tell them, or you choose not to tell them, but it's healing for you. And if you're the one that's dealing with these raw emotions, then you're the one that needs the help. Okay, hostility toward the people that have hurt you or hurt your loved one, going through the motions of living without actually feeling, which is like the same thing as deadness, I think. Well, I got to get up, I got to go to work, I got to have breakfast, I've got to drive my car to the post office, I have a doctor's appointment, etc., etc., etc. And it's like a ritual. It's like you're doing it and you're following the motions, but there's no life to it, there's no vibrancy to it. Suicidal ideations and behavior, which can be threatening and which you may need help with, because if you're thinking about committing suicide, that also can be a symptom of a grief reaction, but it's not a healthy one, and you may need help with it because suicide is never the answer, especially if you think about suicide as a reaction to something else. It's just never healthy, it's never good. And if you do feel suicidal, then you need to talk to somebody who is a specialist in it, because they can help you over that. If a person feels a fresh grief every time the deceased is spoken of, supposing somebody mentions, say you lost your husband or you lost your wife, and anytime anyone mentions your wife or your husband, all of those feelings of grief come up all over again. To a certain degree, that's going to be somewhat normal, but it can happen in such a way that it extends the grief too much, and you're in an extended and complicated grief reaction. When minor events trigger off intense grief, just minor ones. Now, there's always going to be a time, and because it still happens. My mother died years ago, and I still get it sometimes. Something will happen that will remind you of the loved one, and in a sense, you experience the grief all over again. But generally speaking, in normal grief, you remember it, but it doesn't haunt you. You remember something, and maybe there's a few moments of discomfort, but it doesn't take over, and it doesn't make you go through that grief reaction all over again. If it does make you go through that grief reaction all over again, then you need to have help with it. Generally speaking, this gets less and less and less as time goes by, where you can remember the person, you can remember them fondly, but it doesn't have to cause an intense grief reaction like you had after the first weeks, right after the death. So just keep that in mind. And times of loss come up in counseling a lot. If you're going to counseling for other issues and you don't consider grief to be a part of it, it's wise to mention when you've had a grief recently, because a lot of times you will need to have counseling over something that has happened, and it turns out it's related to a grief reaction. So you need to make that information available. I used to tell my counselors, my counselees all the time, I will tell them, if you don't want to tell me something, it's up to you to tell me what you want to tell me, and I don't want to dig in and force you to say something you don't want to say. But at the same time, if you learn to trust me, you'll be willing to say those things that maybe you don't want to say, and then we can get a lot of relief from that. So it is important that you be frank and honest with your counselor in terms of your grief reactions, as well as anything else that you might be seeing the counselor for, because lots of times there is a connection between the two, and the counselor's not going to know it. Now, the counselor may guess it. I've guessed a lot in people I've seen and hit it right on the money. But at the same time, it's better if you tell them and you're honest with them, and they have a chance to deal with you about something, and it can give you a great deal of relief. Now, some survivors cannot move possessions that have to do with the deceased. They kind of build a little altar for the deceased. If a person had a magazine that they liked, they keep that magazine in the same spot and never move it. Or if they had certain clothes draped over a chair or something, then they never move it. They just don't move anything that has to do with the deceased. Now, later on, when you're out of a grief reaction, you should be able to move those things, but I don't say you should get rid of them. Don't get rid of everything that your loved one had. Save some things in terms of as an honor to that person, as a memory for that person. You need to have something. I counseled a little girl who lost her father. And I'm not telling you anything private about it because I don't want to reveal confidences, but one of the things that I suggested was her father gave her a doll, and it was important to her. Sleep with that doll. Have that doll in your bedroom. Have that doll close by. It's like having a piece of your dad right with you. and the mother was there, because I won't see children without the parents being involved. And it was a great, great help. It's like her dad hadn't really left, and it just kind of bridged the gap, so she was able to get over that grief and move on normally. And after a while, she didn't need to have that doll with her all the time. But in those first few stages of grief, right after the death, she needed to have some part of her father with her. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if she keeps that doll for the rest of her life, and that's okay. I think you should keep some things that are symbolic, that are important. I know I have some of my father's band hats. He was a tremendously good musician, studied at the New England Conservatory of Music. He was well known in musical fields. He traveled all over the country. We still have his instruments. I still have his band uniforms. They're things that I will never get rid of. They're a part of him that will stay with me forever. And that's perfectly normal to have that. You need to have those reminders. You need to have the feeling that all is not gone. So there's no problem with that. And so therefore, you need to just keep that in mind. Imitating the dead person is not necessarily a good thing, but sometimes people in a complicated grief reaction will try to be like the other person to the point where they're acting like them. But that denies you your own individuality. So you need to work on not being, celebrating the person that you have lost is great, but you don't become them. You are your own individual person, and it's not healthy to try to become somebody else that you're not. And you need to identify with the deceased, but you can do so in a healthy way, not an unhealthy way. And it is not uncommon for a person who is bereaved to have the same kind of complicated grief reactions and feel grief every holiday of the year. I tell people that if you have a person who's died, the year after they have died, all of the holidays are filled with grief because you're not doing the same things. They're not there to share the holiday with you like they used to. After a while, after the first year, that kind of reaction should gradually subside. You will go through your holidays and be able to go through them. You'll have a different reality. You'll have a different kind of life. You're going to have new rituals that you're going to put in place to replace the old ones. But the first year of holidays is always the worst. It never fails. It's always the worst. And then after those holidays end, at the end of a year after the death, then you should find that that trails off and you're not nearly as bothered by it. You see, grief really does take time, and you can't put a time limit on it. You just can't. People grieve in their own special ways, and they take the time that they need, and you have to give yourself the time that you need to grieve. If it's not complicated and it's normal, you will move through it. If you need help, get it. You do not want it to get into a complicated grief reaction. For that, you need to have help. So I'm going to close it here, and we're going to continue with the study on grief, but we'll go into different phases of it. And remember, I do have this list of phone numbers for crisis and suicide hotlines and for domestic violence in New Hampshire, and I'll be putting this on for every show as we go through these kinds of next few shows. So we'll close it here. Please join me next time.